We are, as you can see from this PowerPoint slide, we're in chapter 23 of Spong's book, and we're working with the, turn down my phone while I'm at it. We're working with his various theses, and one is one that strikes right at the heart, the bullseye of the Christian tradition, and that is the focus on resurrection. And his thesis, basically, how we look at Easter. His thesis is this: the Easter event gave birth to the Christian movement, continues to transform it, but that does not mean that that Easter was the physical resurrection of Jesus' deceased body back into human history. Wow. that is where a lot of people are going to, just stop listening. The earliest biblical records state that God raised him, and we're going to talk about that all the way through the Gospels today. But God raised him into what? We must ask that. The reality of the experience of the resurrection must be separated from its later mythological explanations. So what Spong has been talking about throughout this is general thesis that this explanation from Paul writing to the Corinthians, or actually proclamation from Paul writing to the Corinthians, that Jesus appeared to the disciples, well, first to Peter and then to the disciples, and then, to a larger and larger group, then to 500 people all at once. Well, that's not borne out in the Gospels. We don't see Jesus appearing to 500 people in the Gospels. It's a very small group. It's the disciples who he appears to. But, Spong wants to look at this idea of appearance, and he notes that the word appearance, as it's used in Paul's letter, is the same word that, the Greek Septuagint uses to refer to Moses's experience of the burning bush. That's how God appeared to Moses. Well, we don't really think that God physically appeared to Moses, but Moses had this revelation. Moses had a revelation that was consuming, but would not go away, that God wanted to have God's people liberated from Egypt, that they needed to be reminded of who their God was, Yahweh, I am that I am. And Spong wants to make the point that, throughout the Old Testament, there are people who have these revelatory experiences that are watershed moments. They come through these experiences and see the world in an entirely new way, in a way that might be called a revelation, certainly, but might also, in this context, be called a resurrection. Now, here's where I think we're going to have some difficulty. Spong doesn't go into the history of the resurrection. I'd like to do that a little bit today to talk about just how difficult it is for him to make the argument that he's making. But it's a new insight that helps people live in the world in a way that is transcendent, that it recognizes the presence of God in such a way that hereafter lives will be changed. We see that in the Old Testament. One of the events that Spong talks about, I skipped the Joseph novella last time and got to the point of the prophet, second Isaiah. You might remember that Isaiah was written over a period of about 200 years, and second Isaiah, which is comprised of chapters 40 through 55 in the book of Isaiah itself, was written during the Babylonian captivity and shortly thereafter. And it's in second Isaiah that you have to remember who Isaiah was. He was a priest who had these wonderful memories of what the temple must have been like, if they were memories at all, or if they were just, tales told to him by former priests. But he was of the priestly caste, and he was taken off to Babylon, and there his role was to try to maintain some sort of ritual worship of the God of Israel, lest the Israelites, the people who came from Judah, be completely assimilated into the Babylonian culture. But then when King Cyrus issues an edict that allows the people to go back to Jerusalem, Isaiah, the priest, has all of these magnificent ideas of just what it's going to be like. We're going to go back, we're going to build the temple, and everything's going to be, everything's going to be great. It's just going to be like it was before. Well, he goes back and he encounters what, if I could use a present day example, what Gaza must look like presently, just utter destruction, and falls into a really deep depression. And because you can imagine, because his whole worldview as to what the role of Israel was all about, that city on the hill to whom all the nations will flock, that had very geopolitical aspects to it, right? We're going to be the center of the world, and we're going to have a king again, and on all of those ideas that really have their seat ultimately in David's empire. Well, that wasn't ever going to happen. The political circumstances were such that just wasn't even a possibility. But then Isaiah has this new insight that really forms the foundation of the movement 500 years later of Jesus and his disciples. And you might know the passage in Isaiah, the suffering servant. He had, he took his, now I won't be able to remember it. But the servant of which we often attribute to Jesus dying on the cross, by his stripes we were healed. But really, Isaiah was thinking about a new vocation, a new calling for the people of Israel in Jerusalem. It had nothing to do with the temple. It had nothing to do with the king. It had something to do with a new way of being in the world in which we experience God, or the Jews would experience God, through their suffering. And through their suffering, redemption of the world could take place. New revelation. And thus begins a movement in Judaism based upon that insight. Now, can we say that Isaiah was resurrected from his depression? This is the point that Spong wants to make. Isaiah himself experienced a kind of resurrection through this new revelation, something that enabled him to live a new life and to put away the old. Gone was the dreams of the old Israel, and in its place was a much more complex and a much more difficult way of being in the world that nevertheless affirmed God's presence in suffering. That is what the call of Israel was supposed to be. Now, that there were others who held fast to the idea, no, we're going to have a king, and they kept trying to fight for that. But 500 years down the line, Isaiah's tradition continues in the teaching of Jesus. I think this is what Spong is trying to get at. There are a lot of things that happen in between, you can imagine, in 500 years. But a similar revelation takes place in the minds of the people, in the hearts, actually, interestingly, heart and mind go together in Judaism, but in the identity of individuals in terms of their understanding of God. And it seems to have been the case with Paul, right? Jesus never appears to Paul in a physical body. Paul has a mystical experience. He talks about it in 1 Corinthians 7, I believe. I'm not good on my Bible today, but where he's taken up into a third heaven, and there, experiences Christ sitting at the right hand of God, and has this transformative experience. And then after this experience, sees the world in an entirely new way. He's resurrected, as Spong would have us believe, from his old way of being in the world into a new way of being in the world. That's all well and good. And so here's Spong's, focus here is resurrection, according to him, was not a physical act. No formerly deceased body ever walked out of a tomb. Resurrection was rather a moment of new revelation that occurred when survival-driven humanity, that's very important because that is the so-called original sin of, as Spong sees it. We're so focused on our own survival that we completely obscures our concerns for other people's needs, right? When survival-driven humanity could transcend the limit and give itself that limit and give itself away in love to others, including even those who wish and do us evil. That is a suffering perspective in the world, giving love to others when it's not given back. There's suffering that goes on, yet in that there is redemption, in that there is the revelation of who God truly is. And we can't do that of our own power. It's got to be through some sort of connection with, some sort of oneness and unity with the God who is able to do just that. It is self-sacrificial, which goes against everything our survival-driven human being wants us to do. This was the experience in which a new seeing of both God and life was born. Was this experience enough to be called resurrection? I submit that it was, says Spong. I submit that it wasn't. I think Spong is playing fast and loose with something that was absolutely essential to the Jewish tradition. And that is, if there is going to be any eternal kingdom of God, a kingdom in which there is celebration of creation itself, a renewal of creation at the coming of the Messiah, the only way that those who were saintly, shall we say, in the past, God's righteous of the past, the only way that people could really experience that, could receive their reward, was to be resurrected as bodily beings. Now, I'm talking about Judaism right now. I'm not so much talking about, what later comes out of that, but let's think about the Jewish roots of Jesus. In fact, I talked about this last Sunday in a Sunday school class. If you remember, Greek anthropology is the idea that there is this eternal element called a soul within us, and then there is this body which is subject to change and decrepitude and all of those things. But when we die, our soul remains eternal. Jews, by contrast, did not see human beings that way. If you remember how Adam was created in Genesis, God formed Adam out of the dust, out of the ground of, the earth, and blew the breath of life, the ruach, the spirit, into Adam. And Adam became what? A living being. That's how you are a human being, body and spirit together. If Jesus was going to be the Messiah, and if he was going to usher in a new kingdom of God, the only way that people could truly experience that from the Jewish perspective is if they were resurrected as human beings, as bodies and spirits together. Now, later on, of course, Christianity is going to be influenced by the Greek idea, and they will come up with this notion, and it's very ambiguous throughout the centuries, of a person's body, upon death, going back to the earth, but their soul, there's the Greek idea, goes and stays in repose at the mercy seat of Jesus until Jesus' second coming, in which those souls are given spiritual bodies. Can you see how hybridized that has become? the resurrection of the body is just so essential to the Jewish understanding of the messianic community that it was retained in the Christian tradition. What Spong wants us to do here is to really accept a kind of a Gnosticism. If you remember the Gnostic philosophy, and that Jesus comes to bring a new knowledge, or that something about the experience of Christ imbues us with a new knowledge that helps us see the world in such a way that we recognize and we affirm our unity with God. Spong wants us to see that as a resurrection, and I personally think it is discounting how important Jewish anthropology was to the early church. That people were people because they were embodied creatures until in the second and third century, when the church fathers, who had been versed in Plato and some of the Greek philosophy, they started to apply their logic to the stories themselves, and we get a much more Greco-Roman understanding of how resurrection takes place. But resurrection is absolutely essential to the Jewish tradition. It was hotly debated in Jesus' day. The Sadducees did not, believe anything about it. They just believed the soul went back, or that, human beings lost the spirit, went back to the earth, and, that's it. But you might remember that in the Babylonian captivity, this idea of eternal life was introduced to Jewish thinking. And the group known as the Pharisees kind of took that and made that theologically important to their understanding of the world. But it wasn't a Greek idea of a soul and a body. It was the Jewish idea of a body and spirit together made a human soul. So I know that I've, in many places, said that, and I'm sorry if that is such a review for you, but this is a place where I'm going to, kind of push back a little bit on Spong. He's probably right that in our 21st century Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment era, no one really thinks about the importance of the resurrection of the body the way Jews did in the first century. So should we get rid of it? I think it's going to take a lot more work than Spong thinks is necessary. So any thoughts on that? I'd love to hear what you're thinking, unless I've completely confused you.
Dan, I'll jump in, I guess.
Okay.
The thing that baffles me a bit is, what you're describing in terms of the Jewish conception of the body and how important it was to the early Jews. Spong has to know that.
I know.
I mean, we know that he's an expert on this. I thought and I don't know if I maybe missed this week or I forgot, but you had it in your outline on the Jewish novella or the Joseph novella.
Joseph Novella, right.
I just thought that was brilliant. I
Right.
thought that was a brilliant explication, and it explained a lot about how Matthew, especially Matthew, embodied the Jewish tradition and all of the references, the pieces of silver, the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
Joseph equals Jesus, Jesus equals Moses, the whole
Yeah.
thing that he puts together. Spong has to know this.
Yeah.
I just think that his issue is it's so scientifically unbelievable
Right.
that we have to come up with something else.
Yeah. I
You
think so too.
And he may be right, but he has to know that, and he doesn't really deal with the issue that you raised about the definition of, what is a body. I mean, the whole idea of your immortal soul is completely foreign to the early church members or
Yeah.
Christians or followers,
Yeah.
and he knows that.
Yeah. Right. And this is I just think this is a chink in the armor, but I think he's so committed to establishing these theses and moving forward that I think he maybe intentionally skips over some of this stuff. I know he knows it, but if he explicates it as you're saying, it kind of undermines his argument. So I don't know. I have a hard time imagining resurrection. Abstractly, I like what it says about the affirmation of creation and the body, that unlike the Greeks who believed that anything that changed and was, part of this world of flux was less, if not the Greeks didn't say this, but others, said it was evil, right? So yeah, but it certainly wasn't worthy of God's concern, the body, right? But Jews are different that way. God saw that creation is good, and bodies as well as the spirits that enliven those bodies that create human beings. It's a very, very creation affirming aspect of Christian theology. And it's amazing that given all of the Greek influence in the early Christian tradition, that resurrection was able to hang on. That's the thing that I find amazing, that they didn't go completely Gnostic and say what Spong is saying here. And so you have to wonder about that, right? But I don't know. But this is a stumbling block for me, because when we talk about the resurrection of the body, I can't say that I've just been so influenced by kind of this latent tacit Greek tradition that eternity is something much more spiritual and does not have anything to do with me living in this wonderful body that experiences so many pleasures, right? Eating, sleeping, dreaming, all of this. Look how good that stuff is, right? Think how boring it's going to be just being just like a floating spirit. I want something to eat. Sorry, no, can't. You don't. No body. You don't need anything to eat. Well, Jews affirm this. Christians in the resurrection affirm that, right? That everything that we do, that we love so much, the eating of Alaskan king crab legs and lobster in Maine, for those people lucky enough to spend weeks there at a time, Lynn Friedewald, uh, you know, that's great stuff to that, that's great stuff to hold on to, you know. So anyway, Spong is making it pretty clear that this is what Paul had in mind. And not only Paul, well, let me stop before I move on here. And thank you, Mac, for pointing out the whole Joseph novella. I just decided we were kind of getting behind, and yeah, he does have that little excursus on that. That was enlightening, right? But an example of how throughout Scripture you're seeing people have these revelations that are life transforming, resurrections, you might say. The old has passed away and the new has begun. If we get So Spong is laying out the argument that in the decades of the early church, the original understanding was this, let's just call it mystical understanding of having an encounter with Jesus that changes one's perspective on life and on God. But when we get even to the Gospel of Mark, we do not see in this gospel the appearance of the resurrected Jesus. Jesus does not appear as a bodily form to the disciples. And I think we've talked about this before, but Mark, the shortest gospel, was written in 70 of the Common Era. And when you read the conclusion of Mark, it ends rather abruptly. Let's see if I can read it for you here. It does end rather abruptly. I'm just going to read verses 1 through 8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint Jesus. Very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled back. And they entered the tomb. They saw a young man, all right, it's a young man here, dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." So they went out, fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That's the end of the gospel right there. No Jesus appearing, to the disciples, no Thomas sticking his finger in the hands. Now, that's how it originally ended in 70 of the Common Era. Later on, another ending was appended to this that looks nothing like the Greek that the original Mark was written in. So scholars say, this is, people saw that the discrepancy here between the other three gospels and the fact that there are no resurrection appearances. So they appended this ending in Mark. But if we stick to what Spong is saying, that, this white robed man who later becomes an angel, right, kind of serves as this liturgical functionary, really. He's the one who can tell the story to the people on what's going on, right? The women are bewildered. And, the historicity of this is greatly in question. But it is, like a narrator of a play, it is this white robed man who is able to bring the story together and tie up the loose ends and bring it to a conclusion. Nothing more than that, says Spong. So what Spong says, and here I'm quoting him, "You will see the meaning of resurrection," the white robed messenger seems to say, "when you return to your homes and go about the business of your life. When your eyes are open to the meaning of God found in the midst of life, in expressions of love and the courage to be." White Robe Man doesn't say that, but this is what Spong says his presence in the story is saying. What he doesn't say is that Jesus has been raised as a bodily being, and that's what Spong wants to argue here. So in the first, up until 70 of the Common Era, we don't see this real emphasis, according to Spong, on the bodily resurrection of Jesus. However, when you get to the next Gospels, you see an elaboration on the story. Remember how the Gospels were written: Mark first, and then Matthew, and then Luke, roughly about 15 years after Mark, then finally John. And things get more and more elaborate the further we get into the decades. The literalization of this story, according to Spong, really begins around 70 of the Common Era. We see this, that after Mark has been written, Matthew, who's writing to a different audience altogether, right? Mark was writing to Gentile Christians primarily, he was really trying to explain the Jewish Messiah to Gentile Christians shortly after the destruction of the temple. Matthew, on the other hand, was certainly writing to Jewish followers of Jesus, who we might call Jewish Christians. But the stories, Spong wants to point this out almost ad infinitum, that these gospel stories just do not match up with each other. In some of them, Jesus is going on to Galilee. In Luke, however, he meets the disciples in Jerusalem, right? So which one is it? Did Galilee and Jerusalem are a good day's walk from each other, right? Well, it's all a matter of what Luke is trying to say about who Jesus was and what Matthew is trying to say about who Jesus was, right? The people at the tomb tend to be different. Certainly, Mary Magdalene is the one person who is there consistently, but the women are all different as well. The other place where there's a difference is where the white robed man now becomes an angel, and then later on in Luke becomes two angels, and then later on becomes really Jesus himself. And I want to talk about that when we get to John. But in Matthew is an angel that tells the disciples, it tells Mary Magdalene and the others to go and tell the disciples that Jesus has been raised, and he is going on and he will meet them in Jerusalem. Now, Matthew had Mark sitting in front of him when he was writing his Gospels. So he knows Mark has said he's going to meet you in Jerusalem. So now we need to tie up the loose ends of the story by introducing the story of how Jesus meets them in Jerusalem, meets them bodily. Because what was Matthew doing? He was perpetuating the Jewish tradition, right? This idea of Jesus being this kind of ethereal spirit was far too mystery religion oriented. If Jesus was going to be in any way associated with his messiahship, it would have to be in terms of the bodily resurrection. And this is the place, says Spong, when the bodily resurrection becomes literal. Up until this time, according to Spong, it was symbolic, right? It was a mystical experience that people were having. And I like what Spong has to say on page 186. But let me stop and see if there are any comments about this so far. But you see how the story continues to build. I'm on page 185 to 186. Matthew then relates the details of what had been in Mark, only the promise of a Galilean appearance to the disciples. Oh, excuse me. I can't, all of a sudden I can't make, I can't make sense of that sentence. Sometimes that happens. To the surprise of many fundamentalists, it is not a vision of a resuscitated body that we see in Matthew. Examine the text carefully, closely. Matthew's disciples are physical. They are bound by the laws of nature. They have to climb the mountain. This is where they're going to meet Jesus. Jesus, on the other hand, is quite unbound. He comes out of the sky. He's been raised into the meaning of God. And since God was still thought of as living above the sky, there's that three-tiered universe, Jesus must come from above. So what Spong is saying here, that even in Matthew, we're seeing vestiges of the kind of spiritual Jesus that's getting hybridized with the material Jesus, with the physical Jesus. Please note an important distinction in this narrative. Jesus is not a victim. That, it's really easy to look past that. Matthew is not making Jesus a victim here, which completely undermines the whole suffering servant motif that we were talking about earlier. Jesus is not a victim. He is a victor, glorified and already endowed with heavenly power. He speaks his words. His words would later be called the Great Commission, going out into the world. Go into all the world, make disciples of all the nations, and lo, I am with you always. Was this a missionary charge to go convert the heathen? Not a chance, says Spong. There was no institutional church at that time that felt the need to gain converts. The risen Christ was saying, rather, go beyond your boundaries, your fears, your lines of security. Learn to give yourselves away and know that you are part of who I am. We cannot now be separated. It's a different message of Easter from the one about which we've been previously told. Well, I think there are many among us who are going to say, well, if that's what Jesus is saying, then why didn't he say it? why didn't he just come out and say that, right? Um, you know, I don't know. I can't answer that question. But Spong seems to think, well, this is pretty obvious. It's the only explanation that is going to fit into our 21st century worldview. That the experience of Jesus is one that allows us individually and as a community to extend the bounds that we perceive in terms of our human being. Death itself, in giving ourselves away in love, we transcend, the fear of death. We transcend the finality of death because our love lives on as God lives on. That's a really philosophical way of looking at things. It works for me. It's why, I do what I do, right? I don't need a tombstone on my grave to remind people that I was here. Because if I live well, I will continue to live in those that I have affected and been with in love, as well as those I even haven't. But certainly, it's that paying it forward idea. This is where Spong is going with this. Very philosophical, very mystical, and frankly, very Buddhist. He's got one toe in the deep end of Buddhism right here. Any thoughts about this? I think I think this is why Buddhism is so attractive to so many people in the 21st century, because even though it has been developing for 2,500 years, but it was, founded in the 6th century BCE. It still is relevant to us in terms of our 21st understanding of how the universe works. It sets aside the whole three-tiered understanding of God above and, humans below, and then hell, Sheol beneath us. And I'm all for that, really. Think about how the three-tiered universe justified the divine right of kings, right? The king was the person who was closest to the third tier of God, been divinely chosen. Thus, what the king says is what God says. Look how that is still being manipulated in the fundamentalist tradition that still holds to this idea of a three-tiered universe, And look how there are certain politicians who are saved from assassination at the hand of God, and now sitteth at the right hand of God, and what he says is nearly what God is saying. That three-tiered universe only perpetuates injustice, because there are always going to be people at the bottom of the tier, always people in the middle, and always a few at the top who are calling the shots. So yeah, I'd love to see that three-tiered universe go. This resurrection thing, even though in my heart of hearts, I can't buy into it, it is so central to the Christian tradition. I need better arguments from Spong on this. Luke is the same. Luke continues to elaborate on the resurrection tradition. The story in the women actually now will meet two angels in the tomb, and they tell them to go tell the disciples that Jesus has been raised, and to go on before them, and he will meet them in not Galilee but Jerusalem, right? And here you get the whole road to Emmaus story, and something that affirms the bodily aspect of Jesus. What does Jesus do with the disciples in Emmaus? He sits down and he breaks bread with them, which suggests to me, as soon as the bread is broken, Jesus disappears. But there's something very Jewish about that too. There is the resurrection meal. There is the meal of the new kingdom that is experienced by these disciples. But Spong says this again is yet another mystical experience on the part of these disciples. And then when we get the Gospel of John, it is even more elaborate. And there's something that's really kind of strange about this, because Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb. She sees that it's empty. She runs back, and two disciples, one of them Peter, the other one the beloved disciple, run to see who Jesus, that the tomb was empty. The beloved disciple gets there first. I just want to read this. The beloved disciple gets there first, but Peter, pushes him aside, and then goes in. And then they notice that the tomb is empty. There's no angel there at this time. But then there's this transition in the story, which is really kind of strange. Mary is at the tomb. The disciples appear, Peter and the beloved disciple appear to be in the tomb. And Mary does this. Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. Just that sentence suggests that, there people are probably inside the tomb, just trying to give us where Mary was. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white. Now the angels are there, right? Sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the foot. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They've taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." And when she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there. But she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him, have taken him away, tell me where you've laid him, and I will take him away." And Jesus said to her, "Mary." And she turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father." That, that suggests to me at least a kind of, Mary's holding on to something, right? I don't know. I guess you can read that in a mystical way, but this transition, Mary's outside the tomb. Apparently, Peter and the beloved disciple are inside the tomb, and she sees angels in there, right? Well, where have Peter and the beloved disciple gone? Are they there watching this all along? Did they not see the angels when they went in? This is never really explained. The story moves from Peter and the beloved disciple in the tomb to immediately Mary outside of the tomb, which suggests that we've got two narratives that have been brought together, and not a very good transition that's been made between those. But another story that we find, the story about in John, when the disciples are, in the house, and they're all locked in there, and they're for fear of the Jews, and Jesus appears to them, just out of nowhere, it appears. He kind of walks through walls. And he says, "Peace be with you, and I give you my peace." And he breathes the Holy Spirit into them. Then later, Thomas was there. Later on, same thing happens. Jesus walks through the walls, and Thomas says, "I'm not going to believe it until I see, the hands and the feet." And Jesus puts out his hands, and Thomas literally puts his hands into the wounds of Jesus. Doesn't that suggest a kind of bodily experience, right? All of this is going to be mystified, I guess is the right word for it, by Spong. The one that I find so interesting, though, is Jesus in chapter 21. The disciples, Peter just gets up and says, "I'm going fishing." It's a great line in John. "I'm going fishing. Like I'm through with all this." And the disciples are out there fishing, and on the shore, they see a man who's built a fire. And while they're out there not catching any fish at all, somehow Jesus, we know this man, has got plenty of fish that he is broiling up, And we see in this, and Jesus tells them, "Throw your nets on the other side of the boat." And they hauled in this curious number, 153 fish. And I can give you an explanation of that at some other time, because it's too too long for right now. But all of this is this kind of prefiguration of the messianic meal. Jesus feeding the disciples, Jesus wanting something to eat, right? Bodily. So I'm making my argument against Spong. I don't think you can so easily spiritualize what he wants us to spiritualize. I think there's a very, very strong Jewish orientation, especially in this Gospel of John, that emphasizes the importance of the bodily resurrection. The only way I can agree with Spong on this is to say that, yes, this doesn't jibe with the 21st century understanding of how the world works. God intervening into the laws of nature to set those aside for miraculous things to happen. Now, so the only thing that we're left with is what Spong is suggesting, and that is that this more spiritual understanding of Jesus somehow through his death providing an experience for those who were his followers of a new realization that oneness with God is possible. And that oneness with God involves the importance of living in love for others, even those who may not love you back. That is what will help us to be truly human. And this is enough for Spong. And it's interesting and intriguing for me. I'm still not to the point where I'm going to say it's enough. And I'm going to conclude with that because our next thesis is coming up here. But just let me read this Spong quote, and then I'll see if you have any comments or questions. The Easter experience is on page 188. The Easter experience in the New Testament is not about bodies walking out of graves. It's far more profound than that. It's about God being seen in human life. By God, I do not mean a supernatural, invasive God who violates the laws of nature to enter time and space. I mean a transcendent dimension of life into which all can enter, an experience in which life is expanded, love is unlimited, and being is enhanced. I mean the God whose presence and power calls us all into our essential oneness, our universal consciousness, our interconnectedness. We are part of who and what God is. Set aside is our survival-oriented natural inclinations to think of ourselves first, and a new realization that helps us live forward with an understanding of the interdependence and interconnectedness of all things. And thus we are resurrected. That's Spong's argument. Any thoughts or questions about this? I see Sharon has left us. She was going to leave. Well, if not, I want to tell you where, this is connected as well, this idea of the ascension. But the next thesis we'll be looking at is thesis number 8, which is Spong's part 10. The biblical story of Jesus' ascension assumes a three-tiered universe. That three-tiered universe we want to put aside, a concept that was dismissed some 500 years ago. If Jesus' ascension was a literal event of history, it is beyond the capacity of our 21st century minds to accept or believe it. That sounds familiar. Does the ascension have any other meaning? Or must we defend first century astrophysics? First century astrophysics, I think that's probably not a good terminology there, or a first century conception of how the world is arranged, right? And many of us do. We live in two worlds. Those who are very literalists absolutely have to accept a worldview that just does not jibe with our 21st century worldview. And this is what Spong wants to get away from. So with that, I bid you adieu. And next week when we meet, we're on page about 190, I think is where this starts. And we will get into the idea of the ascension. But as we do that, also remember who else ascended. We've been talking about the Old Testament prophets and how Jesus, recapitulates, some of their deeds. Remember the ascension of Elijah ascending into heaven. This is going to be borrowed, shall we say, by at least two of the gospel writers. And we're going to see a new interpretation of Elijah. So thank you. And I guess I'll see you on Sunday or again sometime. Al and Mac, good seeing you, even though we don't get to see you in church on Sunday, but you're still there with us in spirit.
I don't implied that I don't go to church. I just don't go to the Hastings church, but
of course, no,
in church.
I didn't mean
Not like
to
I'm an
imply it.
apostate or something.
No, I will make it clear that you go to First Presbyterian of Grand, in Grand Island, and Al, I'll make it clear that you go to Presbyterian Church in the in Colorado Springs. I'm assuming. So, but anyway, I'm glad for that. So
Thank you.
I'll see you next Wednesday. Bye, everyone.